Thank you, Tom. Yes, this afternoon I'm supposed to talk about what must be the shortest classical book in all of theosophical literature. And perhaps some of you who have struggled with the secret doctrine may be glad to know that there is a short classical work, namely At the Feet of the Master. We've been devoting these afternoon sessions at this hour to 4 spiritual classics, all in the theosophical tradition. One of them, of course, is pre-theosophical, pre-modern theosophical by a long way, namely the Bhagavad Gita. But the other 3 are all works which grew out of directly the theosophical tradition and by 3 theosophical authors, or writers down, namely Voice of the Silence, Light on the Path, and now At the Feet of the Master. I'm going to tell you first what I'm going to do in the next hour, so that when I do it, it will not come as a surprise, and you'll know where we are. This mysterious word is, of course, an acronym. Everybody knows what acronyms are? Words formed from the initial letters of a phrase, right? From Greek acro, meaning point, and nym, meaning name. So a name made from the points of other words. And this is pronounced, in case you don't know, not as my very gracious introducer did it, but at fotum. And of course it is at the feet of the master. The fact that it forms a sort of meaningful word, at foot, right? Or if you like, at foot, at fotum, is simply a good aspect of an acronym. An acronym ought to somehow suggest the thing that it's an acronym for. All right, what I want to talk about this afternoon is At the Feet of the Master as practice based on theory, as modern style, as delivering a message through its structure, and as containing certain echoes of the Gita, the oldest of those 4 spiritual guidebooks. So let's start at the very beginning, practice based on theory. How many of you in this group have heard, or perhaps even have made, the criticism that theosophy is too intellectual, too theoretical, all a matter of the head, or some variant of that observation? Let's see some hands. Come on, be honest. All right, it's a very common complaint, right? And there is, in fact, some justification to that complaint. For example, what do we do at theosophical meetings like this? We talk about things. We verbalize, and that's an intellectual activity, inevitably. And how do we convey theosophy for the most part other than talking about it as we do in our lodges and study groups? We read about it, which means we publish books and magazines, and all of these are verbal activities. So there is a lot of intellectual verbalizing in theosophy. And that's the basis for that kind of observation. And as I said, the observation has some justice to it. But it's not, in fact, wholly accurate. Madame Blavatsky, in The Key to Theosophy, has a wonderful sentence. Theosophist is who theosophy does. She didn't say that a theosophist is somebody who studies theosophy. She didn't say that a theosophist is somebody who writes about theosophy. She didn't say a theosophist is somebody who reads about theosophy. She said a theosophist is somebody who does theosophy. That's the practical aspect. So at least for HPB, theosophy was a practicality, something you do, not something you study or hear or talk about. And in fact, there is in the theosophical movement as a whole a great deal of very practical activity. Now, most of it is not carried on directly by the Theosophical Society. It tends to be carried on by allied organizations. I'm thinking, for example, of the Theosophical Order of Service, which is not part of the Theosophical Society. You don't have to be a Theosophist to belong to the Theosophical Order of Service. But it does theosophical practical things. Right? Some of those practical things are done. There are various ways you can be practical, right? Is there only one way you can be practical in the world? I hope not, right? There's many ways of being practical as there are people, because each of us does our practice in a slightly different way. So there are other, in fact, allied organizations which carry on one or another kind of practical work. The esoteric school is one which does that. Co-masonry is another one which does that. There are a variety of such allied organizations whose purpose is to do one or another kind of practical thing. Why then does not the Theosophical Society itself focus on practical things? Well, actually, HPB explained this to us. She pointed out that in the world, we have many problems, right? There is injustice, there is oppression, there are shortages, there is pain and suffering in the world, and all of those things need to be addressed. They need to be taken care of. But, said HPB, they are like the symptoms of a disease. When you have a disease, you are likely to have some symptoms, some aches and pains in the body, some fever. You may have an upset stomach, all sorts of symptoms. Do we need to treat those symptoms? Of course they need to be treated. But if we only treat the symptoms, if we only say, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning, will we be any better in the morning? Well, sometimes actually, yes, but not usually, right? In order to treat the cause of the pain, what must we do? We must identify the cause and address the cause, right? Now, what is the cause of injustice, of suffering, of oppression in the world? And it's not what we might think, because sometimes what we think are simply other symptoms. What is the ultimate, basic cause of all of the pains of the world? We can phrase it in various ways, as I just heard you doing, and exactly how we phrase it is not important. But it is, in a sense, ignorance, right? It's that we do not know who we are and where we are and why we're here, right? That's the basic cause of all of the problems of the world. That if we know who we are, if we know what we are, and we know what each other is, then we can relate to one another in a way that will eliminate automatically the symptoms, right? The symptoms will take care of themselves if we address the cause. What is the primary calling of the Theosophical Society? To address the cause, right? What is the first object of the Theosophical Society? To form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color, right? And for that matter, all 3 of the objects address this, because the second object is to encourage study, right? So that we learn about things. And the third object is to investigate the unexplained and the latent. And that, again, is to find out about ourselves and about the world in which we live. So the basic calling of the Theosophical Society is to address the cause of the world's ills and not its symptoms. Other organizations do that. And individual theosophists do that. Annie Besant was a great one for dealing with symptoms, was she not? As well as the cause. I mean, she worked for the rights of the oppressed in England and in India. Right? Colonel Alcott, to this day, a national hero in Sri Lanka because he worked for the rights of native Sri Lankans. Right? These are symptoms they were addressing. So we are all free to work as individuals for whatever causes we consider important, and that's a good thing to do. But the Theosophical Society itself is focused on addressing the cause of the world's illness and not simply the symptoms. All right. There is a practice that is connected with addressing the causes, however. Knowledge, simply head knowledge, is not enough. Listening to talks, reading books is not enough. We have to put those things into practice. And that's where our spiritual classics come in. The Gita, The oldest of them is, of course, also in some ways the most difficult for us in the West to deal with, because it has a setting in a foreign, for us, what is a foreign culture. And yet it deals with eternal realities. And we can find those eternal realities within the Gita. Voice of the Silence and Light on the Path are both much closer to us, and yet they too are, in some sense, removed. About when, I'm not asking for exact dates, just about when, were Voice of the Silence and Light on the Path written down? All right, late 19th century, right? Voice of the Silence, 1889, and Light on the Path a bit before. These are late 19th century productions, and their style, their content is just like the content of the Gita, right? Is universal and timeless. But the style in which that content is expressed is necessarily of a particular time and place. So indeed, the Gita, for example, begins in its very first line, on the field of Dharma, the field of the Kurukshetras. It's setting the scene, which is in North India, thousands and thousands of years ago. That's its setting. Voice of the Silence and Light on the Path do not have explicit historical settings, but their language and their structure and their style is late 19th century. Although they are very old works in terms of their origins, still their English versions are late 19th century. Now, one of the remarkable things about At the Feet of the Master is that not only is it the shortest of these little books, but it is also the most contemporary. And I'm getting now to modern style. That is really quite remarkable. At the Feet of the Master is a modern work in terms of its stylistic presentation of its content. It is short, and don't we like short things today? And we like short things today even more than we did when At the Feet of the Master was first written down, right? Think about what's happened to newspapers within our lifetimes. In fact, within the last 10 or 15 years. Almost no long stories anymore, all little short ones. That's our attention span, right? We like short things. It is also very clear, right? Very clear indeed. It's very simple in its presentation. Language is what a 14-year-old child might understand, because after all, it was given to a 14-year-old child. It is also extremely practical. It consists of a series of very practical bits of advice on what to do. And it is prosaic. Not in the bad sense of prosaic, it's prose. Light on the Path and Voice of the Silence, and certainly the Gita, are really poetry. Beautiful poetry, moving poetry. But let me ask you, be honest, how many of you pick up a book of poems to read in your free time? If you have something you want to read of an evening, how many of you pick up a book of poems to read? I expect to see some hands, because there are strange people in the world. I'm one of them. I'm one of them, right? I'm so strange that I read dictionaries for fun. But is the reading of poetry part of modern culture, part of our modern tradition? No. That's a 19th century tradition. And so what we have At the Feet of the Master is straightforward, clear prose exposition of some of the same basic ideas one finds in the Gita, in Voice of the Silence, in Light on the Path. All right. So far, so good. Let's look at what it is that At the Feet of the Master is saying. It tells us in the very beginning that there are 4 qualifications for those who want to enter the path, and it lists them. And they are discrimination, desirelessness, good conduct, and love. And then its structure is that it treats each of these in 4 succeeding sections. Now, I believe that, obviously these 4 qualifications were not invented by the master who gave this instruction to the young Krishnamurti. These are out of a famous Indian, or they, at least they're treated in a famous Indian work, the Viveka Chudamani, the crest jewel of wisdom. But they are treated in the crest jewel of wisdom only partially. The crest jewel of wisdom is about a great many other things than these 4 qualifications, whereas these 4 become the entire subject matter of At the Feet of the Master. And I think that there is an interesting structural connection between these 4 parts. At least when I first read At the Feet of the Master, I was impressed by it, mainly because it was so easy to read, amid so many things that are difficult to read. But at the same time, I just sort of took one thing after another and didn't pay much attention to how they were connected. What I want to suggest to you this afternoon is that there is a very interesting connection between these 4 qualifications. In fact, they lead on one from the next in a very significant way. So the book is remarkably unified in its presentation. Discrimination, the very first one. That, of course, is a bad word today, right? Words have a tendency to do what linguists call pejorate. That's from a Latin word pejor, which means worse. It's the comparative of the adjective bad. And words tend to get worse in their meanings. It happens all of the time. For example, the word knave, K-N-A-V-E, originally in English meant boy, just any boy. But it comes to mean instead someone who does bad things. The word boor, B-O-O-R, originally meant simply a farmer. Right? It's just the old English word for farmer. And now, of course, it means somebody that puts you to sleep. Yes, of course. You've got German, Dutch parallels to that. So words tend to degenerate in meaning. I think maybe that says something about human nature. I'm not sure. They tend to go down in meaning rather than up. And so that has happened with discrimination. What does discrimination mean today in normal use? Or it implies racism, or it could imply ageism, right? It means judging improperly on the wrong basis, right? Making wrong judgments, making prejudicial judgments. That's obviously not what it means here. To discriminate here and discrimination here means making good distinctions, making valid, true distinctions between things, right? And that's what discrimination is about. Now we must begin then by discriminating. That's the first step. And oh, that is so true, and discrimination has perhaps never been more necessary in the history of the world than it is today, right? Making wise, sensible distinctions and choices among things. How many of you, at some point or another, swing on the web? Use the internet. What do you find on the internet? A wonderful, amazing variety of things, some very useful information, some inspiring things, and a lot of pop-ups, right? A lot of efforts to manipulate, right? A lot of efforts to put across somebody's pet notion. And so what does using the internet require of us? Discrimination, right? So discrimination is the important thing in all of life, perhaps more so today than ever before. The second qualification, desirelessness, is, I think, a little tricky. I don't believe it means, just as discrimination does not mean what we mean by it today, I don't think desirelessness means what it might seem to mean literally, namely the state of being without desires. Let me suggest to you that anybody who is without desires, completely without desires, is not holy, they are dead. There's a wonderful passage from the Vedas, from the Rig Veda. As a matter of fact, HBB quotes this at the beginning of The Secret Doctrine. She doesn't quote the whole thing, but she quotes part of it. It's called the Hymn of Creation. It talks about how the universe, how the cosmos comes into existence. And she quotes at the beginning of The Secret Doctrine because its description of how the universe comes into existence is very, very similar to that in the stanzas of Zen, on which The Secret Doctrine is based. But part she leaves out, and the part she leaves out I think is extraordinarily interesting and important and relevant to what we're talking about. The Hymn of Creation in the Rig Veda says, the first thing which comes into existence in the world is, guess what? Kama, desire, right? Desire comes into beginning first, and everything springs from it. Now, how do we reconcile this fact that desire is the initial force which brings all of creation into existence, and therefore cannot possibly be bad, right? It's got to be basically good. How do we reconcile that with the fact that desire has got a bad name, the same way discrimination has come to have a bad name? Well, the Greeks talked about this, right? The Greeks had a word for everything. In fact, sometimes they had two words. But in this case, they had one word with two meanings. They explained that there was a god whose name was Eros, desire, right? But in fact, there were two different gods who happened to share the same name, Eros. One of the gods named Eros was a little fellow who ran around with a bow and arrow and shot his arrows into people to make them fall in love with other people, right? This was the terrestrial or earthly Eros. And he was a wicked little fellow that would get us into all sorts of trouble if we let him. But there was another god named Eros, who was the celestial Eros, and he was quite different. He was the god who brought the universe into being in the first place. He occurs as the motivating force in the generation of the cosmos in Hesiod's genealogy of the universe. He is the same as that Kama of the Hymn of Creation. There is a heavenly desire and there is an earthly desire, and they are not the same. They share something, actually, but they're not the same. All right, so when we talk about desirelessness, we aren't talking about being without any desire at all, I think, but rather being without certain kinds of desires. Now, what kinds of desires are we talking about being without here? Well, here, in fact, the Sanskrit word is helpful. Underneath the four terms from At the Feet of the Master, I have written the four Sanskrit terms that are used in the Viveka Chudamani. And these will be familiar to many of us. Discrimination is, of course, Viveka. The term for desirelessness is Vairagya. Now, Vairagya is a very interesting word because at its basis, at its root, is the word raga. And raga in Sanskrit has several meanings. Anyone here a fan of Indian music? Ravi Shankar and all of that? Are you familiar with the ragas then? Ragas are different modes of music, right? Some are appropriate for the morning, some for the evening. They're appropriate at different times of day. They're appropriate also for what else? Different moods, right? And the word raga means, among other things, color. So the ragas are different colorations, right? And don't we use colors to represent moods of things? You're in a blue mood, right? What other uses of color do we have like this? To see red, right? To be green with envy. To be in a brown study. Yeah, someone is yellow, got a yellow streak. Looking at the world through Rose-colored glasses, right? To be in a really black mood, right? All right, so we use colors to suggest emotions and emotional attitudes. What happens if, in one of my favorite stories, one of my favorite bits of fiction, The Wizard of Oz, the heroine, Dorothy, comes to a city in the center of Oz known as the Emerald City. And before anybody can be admitted into the Emerald City, something has to happen to them. Does anybody remember what has to happen?
Gotta have the green glasses locked on.
You have to put on a pair of glasses with green lenses, right? And then consequently, everything you see in the Emerald City is green, all right? If we put on not green glasses, but rose-colored glasses, everything we see is rosy, right? Pink. If we have different colored lenses in our glasses, we are going to see the world not as it is, but as it is colored by our glasses, right? Now, clairvoyants tell us that when we feel a strong emotion, our aura is flooded with that emotion, and clairvoyants see it as a color, right? In fact, very much these colors we've been talking about. Now, if our aura is flooded with the red of anger, how is the world going to seem to us? Angry. Everything around us is going to seem angry because we are looking at it through anger-colored glasses, namely our anger-colored aura. Right? That is to say, the anger is not in the world. Where is the anger? It's in us. And that's true of any emotion, whatever it is, good emotion or bad emotion. Whatever emotion we have is going to color our perception. So we do not see reality as it is. We see it only as that emotion allows us to see it. It blocks out everything else. Well, that's not a good thing, is it? Don't we want to see the world as it really is? Well, if you listen to the Gita, we do. That's one of the main points of the Gita, that we must see the world as it truly is. We must see things as they are. Some of you will know I've said this before, but I can't resist saying it again because it's appropriate for this group, for this subject. There is a mantra of the Gita, and the mantra is Om Tat Sat. And this would be translated, if you want to translate it literally. Of course, you can't translate Om, right? That's impossible. It's a great symbolic word. You can talk about the symbolism, but there's no English word to translate Om, right? Tat you can translate. Tat is simply the demonstrative article in Sanskrit. It means that. And Sat you can translate. Sat is simply the present participle of the verb to be, and so it means being. And therefore, Om Tat Sat would be literally translated as Om, that being, which doesn't make a lot of meaning in itself. Adele and I have a good friend who's a Scotsman. I must be very careful in not calling him an Englishman. That makes him see red. He's a Scotsman, and he has written a book which is a commentary on the Gita, which is one of my favorite commentaries. He spent many years in India teaching in schools in India. And he has a translation of the mantra of the Gita, which is my favorite. His translation is, well, that's the way it is. And that's what Arjuna learns in that poem. The way it is. The way it is inside him, the way it is outside him. He learns what things really are. He sees the world not through colored glasses, but clearly. Now, how does this relate to Vairagya? Well, the root of the word Vairagya is raga, meaning a color, and Vairagya means colorlessness, being without color. And that's what desirelessness really means, that we should see the world as it is, not colored by our desires, right? Or our fears, or our wants, or our loves, or our hates, right? But to see things as they truly are. That is Vairagya, right? To be colorless.
The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Okay. Now, as it happens, there is between these two a little problem. In fact, the problem is there's a vicious circle, or a catch-22. You all know catch-22? Remember it from Joseph Heller's novel of that name? Briefly, anybody here not know the novel? Okay, briefly, the novel is about as I recall, he's an airman, a member of the Air Force in North Africa during World War II. And he was not terribly happy. He wanted to get out of there. It was dangerous. It was uncomfortable. And so he wanted to get relieved of that assignment. And in fact, there was a way to do it. There was a military rule which allowed people to be discharged from the Air Force. But there was only one reason that permitted such discharge, and that was if you were insane. The military didn't want you if you were insane. So if you were insane, you could get discharged. So you could apply to be discharged on the grounds of insanity. Now, the problem with that was anybody who was sane would want to get discharged from that situation. Consequently, to apply to be discharged proved you were sane. But the only reason you could be discharged was on the grounds of insanity. And that was Rule 22, right? And so catch-22 means a situation in which you've got two requirements which cancel one another out, which prevent one another. In a sense, Viveka and Vairagya, in a sense, discrimination and desirelessness are a catch-22. If we are to discriminate, if we are to make wise choices, we must be able to see the world clearly, unconditioned, without conditions, right? That's the same thing. Conditioning is the same thing as those colored glasses we've got, right? We can't make wise choices if we are not seeing things as they really are. Isn't that true? If we're seeing things falsely, we can't choose wisely. On the other hand, to see things as they really are, to see things truly, we have to make the choice of how to do it. We have to make a wise choice. So in order to have Vairagya, you've got to have, first, Viveka. But to have Viveka, you've got to have Vairagya. We're in a catch-22. How do we get out of this catch-22? Aha, at the feet of the Master tells us. The way we get out of it is the third qualification. There are 6 points of good conduct. All we have to do is follow these points of good conduct, and we will get out of the particular catch-22 we have found ourselves in. Now, this may seem a little strange, but actually it's not. If we behave in a certain way, we will change our perception of the world. That's a fact. If you go through life with your face constantly like mine is now, if you go through with this kind of expression on your face all the time, how are you going to end up feeling? Grumbly, right? Grumpy. And how are people going to react to you? In the same way, and that's going to reinforce the grumpiness, and it's going to increase it, right? But if you go through the world with a smile on your face, how are you going to feel? You're going to feel cheerful. You're going to feel happy. And how are people going to respond to you normally? In a nice, friendly way, right? And that's going to reinforce it again. The fact is that our behavior affects the way we perceive the world and the way others perceive us. And hence, our behavior affects the way things are. There's nothing new or unusual about this. Hamlet, in a particularly emotionally charged scene with his mother, Gertrude, tells her, "Assume a virtue if you have it not. Now, Hamlet was not telling Queen Gertrude to be dishonest. He wasn't telling her to dissimulate. He was pointing out this very practical bit of psychology. Assume a virtue if you have it not. If you behave according to a certain virtue, what will be the result? You will develop the virtue, right? If you follow certain behavioral patterns. And this is the basis of all practical advice in life, right? If you behave in a certain way, then the result will be you will change as a result of that change in behavior.
Fake it till you make it.
Fake it till you make it. Right, exactly. Precisely so. Fake here not being a bad word, but it's like assume, right? Assume a virtue if you have it not. So these 6 points of good conduct are prescriptions for behavior which will break the vicious cycle and let us see the world as it really is, and hence let us make wise decisions. They are very interesting ones. We don't have time to go into all 6 of them by any means, but they themselves are 6 very interesting ones. The very first one is self-control as to the mind. And it's extraordinarily important, I think, that that is the very first one. Incidentally, these 6 things, these 6 qualifications, these 6 points of good conduct, do not deal with specific do's and don'ts, right? Doesn't say do this and don't do that. It rather treats general matters, right? Principles of behavior, rather than specific acts of behavior. And the very first one, self-control as to the mind. Everything we do, unless it is just pure accident, we do with intention. The mind is involved first. Annie Besant talks about this in several of her books. She talks about it in Thought Power. She talks about it in Study in Consciousness. We begin with an idea, and that idea then we externalize in our actions and in our behavior. So we begin by thinking. Again, there's an old saying, thinking makes it so. Right? Now, this kind of thinking that makes it so is a very conscious, intentional thinking. It's not wishful thinking, which is another matter altogether. Right? Vairagya is also referred to in the Gita as nishkama karma. Karma, action, right? Doing something. Kama, desire again, right? Nish, not. So nishkama karma is action without desire. Right? And that's what, and the desire here is the desire which is connected with those colored glasses. Right? Desire for personal benefit. Where I think I can do something that will benefit me, and I don't care what effect it has on anybody else, because that's not important. Right? That's the kind of desire one must get rid of. All right, that's nishkama karma. Ravi Ravindra, who is an old friend of ours, and many of you have heard him speak, gave a talk about 2 years ago at Algeo, in which he talked about not nishkama karma, but rather about nishkarma kama, desire without action. Desire without action is wishful thinking, right? Where you've got the desire, but don't do anything with it. And that's the opposite of nishkama karma. And it's not wishful thinking we're talking about here when we talk about self-control as to the mind. It is rather intentional thinking where the will is involved to do something. All right, as I said, we don't have time to go through all 6 of these, but I invite you to read them, and I want to suggest to you that one follows the other in very interesting ways. The 6 points of conduct are interlinked. They lead on one to the next, but I'll leave that to you all to observe. Now, if one practices these 6 points of conduct, this pattern of behavior, then that breaks the catch-22 of Viveka and Vairagya and lets us lead on to the 4th qualification, which is love. And At the Feet of the Master says something very important about love. It says that this qualification is the most important of them all because with it, all of the others will come along. If you have it, all of the others will come along. And if you don't have it, all of the others are not adequate. They won't do, right? It is essential. It is both first and last. But also, At the Feet of the Master tells us what love is. And that's very important because we talk about love a lot, but we tend to have what is often a very peculiar idea, I think, about love. We think of it as being something warm and fuzzy, something sentimental, something smooth and soft and comforting. Well, real love is those things, but those things are not its essence. Those are what philosophers used to call accidents. They are its attributes. They aren't of its core. Here again, the Sanskrit term used in the Viveka Chudamani is interesting, mumukshutva. And that is translated as an intense desire for liberation, an intense desire for freedom. Now, freedom is either freedom from something or freedom to something, right? It has the 2 sides. We usually think of freedom as being freedom from something, liberation from something. But that's a negative kind of freedom. And the kind of freedom talked about here, the kind of liberation talked about here, is a positive one. It is freedom to. It is liberation to. And what is it that we are liberated to? Well, that's the way it is. We are liberated to understand what the world really is and what we really are and why we are here in this world. We can call that, if we like, God, or we can call it anything else we want. But it is a realization of our unity, our identity with that ultimate reality, which is at the basis of all things. And that is love, right? And love here, we are told, is not an emotion at all. Rather, love is, and now I'm quoting directly from At the Feet of the Master, it is will, resolve, determination. Okay? Now, isn't that rather different from what we tend to think of as love? Will, resolve, determination. There's the old story about the seeker for liberation, for salvation, who went to his guru and said, I want to be liberated. And the teacher, the guru, said, come with me, and took him down to the riverbank and waded into the river with him. And when they got up to about chest level in the water, the teacher put his hands on the shoulder of the student and forced him under the water and held him there, and held him, and held him, and held him, and finally let him go, and the student shot up out of the water, gasping for breath, and the teacher said, and what were you thinking while you were under the water? And the student replied, I had only one thought, air, air, I want air. And the teacher said, when you want salvation, liberation, enlightenment, with that same determination, you will have it. Right? And that's what love is, right? Love is a complete and utter dedication, a complete giving of oneself to that ultimate great good, which is God, reality, whatever we want to call it. And that has consequences, because when we give ourselves to that, then all of our behavior changes. We don't have to worry about 6 points of good conduct, right? We don't have to worry about taking off colored glasses. We don't have to worry about wise choices. When we have made that kind of complete and utter dedication, then everything else follows automatically. And that, in essence, is what At the Feet of the Master is about. It's about how to move through these 4 steps to that final one, which is also, in a sense, the first one. The complete dedication to the way things are. So this little book, which is very easy to read, is an extraordinarily profound and deep little book. It's got in it everything one needs to know to begin the practice of Theosophy. And those who read this little book and try to follow it, I don't say follow it, because to follow it completely, we would all be masters. And one of the great comforting things is that we are not asked to succeed. Remember what Master K.H. wrote to Mr. Sinnett. We ask only one thing of those who would follow us. Try. That's very comforting. We are not asked to succeed. We are asked only to try. And this little book is, I think, the best guide we have to trying. I will be entertained by questions. Yes, ma'am.
What do you see, if anything, as the connection between desirelessness and addiction?
Addiction is an interesting word. Again, it's one of those words that has come in recent times to be used for all sorts of things. It was, of course, initially a medical term, right? But now we come to use addiction to mean I'm addicted to television. And that just means I like to watch television in my spare time, right? It means no more than that. But I assume you're using addiction in the medical sense, the literal sense, which is that you want so much something that you're willing to do almost anything to get it, right? It has become the most important thing in your life, that's addiction, whether that thing is alcohol or drugs or whatever. Well, obviously, that is a case of wearing glasses that are of such a deep hue that one can see nothing in the world at all except the one thing that those glasses permit one to see. So addiction is the state of emotional dominance, right? Physical and emotional and mental dominance that Vairagya is especially intended to cure. We all have little preferences, little likes for things. Some of you will know one of mine is chocolate. I am told that I'm addicted to chocolate. No, I'm not addicted to chocolate in the medical sense. I happen to like it, right? But little likings of little things are quite different from addiction. Right? And the addiction is a pathological liking, right? A dependence on. an obsession and a compulsion. And so certainly that's the ultimate thing which Vairagya would address. Do we need to overcome that?
Comment, John, on why justice.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. I didn't. One of the things I meant to do, and I didn't have time to do it. I didn't get down to the last, the echoes of the Gita. Let me just mention it very quickly, and then I'll talk about the other. I think there is a remarkable similarity between the four qualifications of at the feet of the master and what happens in the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, the young hero. Arjuna, at the beginning of that poem, is in a state in which he has lost all discrimination. He's faced with two choices, a choice between two alternatives, and he doesn't know which to choose. Right? One is to fight in a war, and the other is not to fight. And this is a real problem because he has a conflict of duties. His duty is to fight, and yet he's fighting against relatives, and that's a no-no. So he has a conflict here, and he has to make a choice, and he has lost all discrimination, and he can't. And so Krishna begins to talk with Arjuna, and he tells him that what you need to do is to develop an unconditioned state. You need to develop Vairagya, right? Nishkama karma, right? You need to act without being blinded by desires. And these are those colored glasses. And at one point, Arjuna says, how do you do this? This is hard to do. And this is the problem that we've run into, the catch-22. How do you do this? And Krishna's answer is by constant practice. And that's precisely the points of conduct, right? You practice this, you try, right? Repeatedly. And when Arjuna finally gets the idea, he's rather a slow learner, actually. By the 18th book of the poem, when Arjuna finally gets the idea, Krishna asks him, have you heard me, Arjuna? Have you understood what I have been saying? And Arjuna says, yes, Krishna, I have heard you. I understand, and I will do according to your word. Now, why is Arjuna doing according to Krishna's word at the end of that poem? It's because Arjuna has learned who he is. He has come to self-knowledge at the end of the poem. And who he is, of course, Krishna. Right? He has recognized that he and Krishna are the same. So there is no choice. Right? There is, to quote a title of a work, no other way to go. Right? It's one of the great, as Tony Lisi has pointed out in this room in the past, there is a great paradox here. The more we know, the less choice we have. And we have less choice because when you know, there is no more choice anymore. Right? There is only what is there. There is only the one way. So when we come to full knowledge, there ceases to be any choice. Right? Because what is clear. So at the end of the so I think that there's a very interesting parallel. I think we can see the Gita. One can see the Gita actually, Joy, not very clearly in certain portions of Light on the Path, because you pointed that out in your book on Light on the Path. The Gita tends to echo through all of these works, and I think it echoes in At the Feet of the Master as well. What I put down here were 4 classical virtues. Those go back to Aristotle. And if I'd had time, what I wanted to say was these ideas we're talking about are not limited to the East. One finds them in the Western tradition just as well. Aristotle talked about 4 natural virtues. And they are prudence. And what is prudence? Making wise choices. He talked about temperance, and temperance is finding a moderate way. And he talked about fortitude, and fortitude is hanging in there, trying, right? Following principles of good conduct. And he said that the last of them is justice. And justice, and we think of justice often, again, as being a blind woman, right? woman with eyes blinded. But justice is what is right. Justice is what is true. And so justice is love, because love is will, determination, and truth. So I think there's an interesting parallel between the Aristotelian 4 natural virtues and the 4 qualifications for the path. This little book, simple as it is, has great depths of meaning in it. Of it, one can say what Annie Besant said of Theosophy, that it has shallows in which even a child may safely wade, and depths in which even a giant must swim. So this deceptively simple little book, which can be read by anybody with profit, can also be studied with great intensity to discover very deep truths.